So now we have a website, a web application that's driven by a database from the CRUD that we talked about, create, read, update, delete. We have the R covered. We are reading from a database. In the next few classes and the homework, we asked to implement the other functionalities. But what I want to start with, and what we covered in the class in the last few classes, is more about the code quality and how to. It's not enough to just have code that does what we want to do. It needs to be maintainable. It has to be elegant. There are a lot of things around code that's more than just getting it up and running. So let's first of all commit what we have so far. As we said, always we commit often. We have good commit messages, so we added the single post view. Now if I look at these two routes that I have in the root one here and the second one with single post, it's almost the same code. So we connect to Mongo connection. We have a start a cursor. We call it post, and we have query parameter. This is different between the two calls. So in the single post one, we pass the ID, and in this one we pass an empty object. And then again we do the same thing, cursor.toArray. We close the database connection, and then the second part that's different is what we call after we get the post. So in one case we call the index view, in the other one we call the single post view. So if we recap, then we have the same functionality except for two parts that are different, the query and what we render. So that gives us a clue that we can extract these two calls and just make one function that has this functionality and reuse it. And when we do that, we follow the dry principle: do not repeat yourself, which, as we say, is very important, that we don't have duplicated code unnecessarily, because if we have duplicated code, that means that if we have a bug, it can appear twice. We have to fix it in two places. It's harder to maintain. So let's create a function then that we will call get post. We will use the ES6 syntax because we should be used to it by now. The parameters that this function will take are basically what changes between the two calls. So one of them will be the query parameter, and the second one is the rest.render that we have here, what we do when we get the post back. So the second one will be a function because this is not, will be a callback function. The functions in JavaScript are first-class citizens, so we can pass them around. So if we want to encapsulate this behavior here or this behavior here, we can just put it in a function and pass it to our getPost function. And when it's successful, when it does the call to Mongo client, it just calls whatever function it's passed to. So let's have the second parameter called success callback. So the get post will do basically the same as what we have, exactly the same here, except that instead of calling the query parameter will be passed as an argument to the function, and then instead of calling the res.render immediately, we will call the callback function that we get, and we will call it with the post that we get from the call to Mongo. And to follow the convention of Mongo, we of Node, we will just call it with the error as a first parameter and the post as a second parameter. So now we can take out all of this code here. Let's comment it out for now. And all what we need to do is to call our new get posts, and we will pass it the first parameter query as an empty object in this case, and then we'll give it a callback here. We need to define this callback, and this will take an error and posts, and once it gets the post, it will just render the index, and it will use the posts that are passed to it from the callback here. Let's delete this, and then here in the second one it will be a very similar code, so we can delete all of that code as well, and we just will define, we'll take this to be our callback function, and again it takes error and post, and then it will render the single post, and then we can call get post, and in this case we'll pass it the ID query parameter that we did before as a first parameter here, and as a second parameter we'll pass it the callback. So this callback will be called this one here, and we can get rid of the old code. So as you see, we managed to extract a lot of the duplication that we had. We just have one function, so for example, if the name of the collection changes, we only need to change it in one place instead of having in two places. If the connection string changes, the same, it will be just one place. So we were not repeating ourselves unnecessarily. We are making it less likely to have bugs. If we have bugs, they are in one place, we fix them in one place, and so on. So now if we go and check our website, it should actually be working exactly the same that it was, because it's the same functionality, just but done in slightly better code. The next step that we can take this a step further, and now we have this code all in one file in our site controller. But this is really not related to site controller. We can make use of Node modules to just put this in its own different module and just import it. And that means that we can reuse this code from different controllers. We have an API controller, for example, that might need the same functionality, so it doesn't need to be tied to site controller. So I'll just go ahead and create a new module here under helper. I'll call it dbclient.js, and I can just take this get post here, and just put it in dbclient. We'll still need the object ID on the other file, and just module export get post, or we can choose to put it in an object. As we know, in ES6 we don't need to say get post if it's called get post here. So if it's the same value field, we can just have a shortcut to say get post. And also another handy ES6 functionality is we can use destructuring to get Mongo client here. So instead of having this, it's basically this code is equivalent to that. Just trying to make use of nice ES6 features. So now we have the DB client here in its own module. It exports get post. On the other side, we can require it and use it. So we can say const DB client and require. We go 2 steps back from where we are. We're in controllers, so this is now we're in the file system. So we go helpers DB client, and this now we have DB client, and we can access DB client.getPost and DB client.getPost in this case, and that should hopefully still work. So our code now looks much cleaner. We have the DB client in a separate module. We're requiring it, we're using it. We don't have that much duplicated code anymore. We have modular code, and it can still be improved. We can use more ES6 stuff here, for example. It's just sugar syntax to be able to have nicer code. But the important part of what we did is just how we managed to see duplication and decide what parameters can be taken out, and how we can extract a method out of that duplicate code. So whenever you have duplication, it's a hint for you that this can be extracted into a method, and what changes between the duplicate code, it becomes a parameter. So we had the query parameter in that case, and the second part was a callback. And callback also is a very important thing to understand in JavaScript. So it's basically a function. We're passing a function to a function, and we can call it after we do something. And we've already been using that in several places. So here Express itself uses callback. So when we define routes here, all of this is a callback. We have a couple of callbacks in Mongo client. So when we connect, when we call to array, and so on. There are more improvements that we can do here. For example, this doesn't need to be get post. It can be just a generic get, and post itself can be passed as a parameter to our function. We should also have better error handling. For example, that if we get an error, then we should probably res.send status to 500, for example. Else we res.render the index. We will cover that in the future, but mainly as a pattern in Node, when you get error, you check if the error is empty, and if it's empty, you do your happy path. If it's not empty, you should handle that error. For example, we can show an error page The error can be anything from a database connection failing or connection does not exist or so on. But the least that we can do at least is to console error this the error if there is an error, and that will be handy. So the main thing to take out of this is that we want to emphasize that you have to write good code. In the repo for this exercise and the homework, we added few points that are especially important. So they talked about dry, don't repeat yourself. You should not have duplicate code. If you have duplicate code, your code is harder to maintain, is more likely to have bugs, it's harder to fix the bugs. The other thing is to have modular code. Like we did now, we separated our code in DB client module, and this is something very powerful in Node, that we have the ability to have modules and just use module export to define one and require to then require the module. So always have modular code and put code that fits together logically in the same module. And also naming, which is one of the fundamental things and very important things to follow. Have very good names for your variables. It's not very easy sometimes to find a good name, but I mean, variables are just pointers to anything. We could easily, instead of having Mongo connection, we can have call this X, and it will work, the code will work. But then when someone else comes and looks at your code and try to understand it or add to it, it's impossible for them in a large code base especially to know what you want to do. So always have good variable names for everything, have them descriptive, and don't be lazy basically when defining variables. Have good names for them.